Hi, this is Trevor Conquergood. Welcome to this week's R&K Software Club's video for the week, and the topic for this week is about underlay. Underlay is the first stitches that sew before the top stitching, and for example, I have created a standard fill of the shape of an apple, and if you watch it stitch out, the first stitches that sew are known as the underlay, and they become the foundation that helps support the top stitching. And so they're actually some of the most important stitches in an embroidery design. And the cool thing is, if you select your shape, you can look in the properties box, and it's not on the first tab, which is where you can choose the kind of fill and the stitch length and the density. And of course, there are other tabs that are other, properties that could be changed about your shape. Well, the second one is called underlay. And this is a really important part because these stitches, depending on the fabric you sew on and depending on the type of shape and size, you will change the kinds of underlay. Now, notice when I open up this shape and I look at the underlay tab that there's a check mark for perpendicular. That means that is the type that is currently applied on this. And so the reason it's called perpendicular is because the underlay goes at a 90-degree angle to the top stitching. And so this apple is filled at the 0 angle, and therefore the underlay is at the 90 angle. But if you change the angle of the top stitching, so if I was to select the apple and use the shape tool to change the direction of the top stitches, then you'll notice that it also affects the direction of the underlay. They'll always be perpendicular. And perpendicular is the most common underlay for a large area of fill. The rows of run stitch that sew back and forth will sew your fabric together with the stabilizer, and they form a barrier that stops these stitches from, fully sinking down and into the fabric. But there were other options. And oftentimes with a large area of fill, we'll also put a contour stitch, especially if there's two areas of fill that are touching each other. Then that extra layer, so now we have a contour layer that goes around the apple before adding the perpendicular layer. And like I was saying, that contour layer, if there was two layers of fill that were overlapping each other, because they touch, this will help give a nice clean edge and stop the fill from sort of bleeding together. And in general, the contour underlay helps clean up the edge of your shape. And so it's common to have both on the shape. The opposite of perpendicular would be parallel. If you put a parallel underlay, then the underlay stitching will go at the same direction as the top stitches. And so that is a common one, especially when we're doing smaller sort of satin stitch areas. And so really it depends on the kind of stitch, which kinds to choose, and it really depends a little bit on what kind of fabric to how much underlay needs to be added. Because notice that you can change to, for example, a lattice underlay and turn off the parallel. And now the underlay goes at an angle as opposed to a perpendicular. So it's not quite 90, it's more like a 45 degree. And so that's called a lattice underlay. And then the other option would be a full lattice. So if I do a full lattice, then it does two layers of underlay, giving extra support. And so having, two different directions will give even more support to the top stitching. And so that's common for, very thick fabrics like a fleece or something like that. And also in here, there's the option to tell it to travel along the edge. And travel along the edge has to do with the actual, here, before we check this off, it has to do with the travel stitches. So when this design stitches out, after it does the underlay underneath this sort of top area, it then travels to the other side to do the underlay coming the opposite direction, and it'll probably be coming towards here. Well, that's where if you select edge travel, so if I select this shape and go to the properties, notice now that all the travel stitches will stay very organized and avoid walking down the middle of your shapes. And so it gives kind of a cleaner underlay look. And really that's going to be more important for times when your top stitching is a little bit open and you might see through it, and you don't want that kind of one stitch walking sort of through the center. So as you can see, there's a lot of different choices, and there's a lot of different kind of things that you might consider as to why to change them. And as I said earlier, it depends on the kind of stitch. So if I change this from a fill to a steel stitch, then notice that the underlay tab has changed. And some things like perpendicular are no longer available, or full lattice. And it was the opposite when I had a standard fill. I didn't have the option of doing the center line or the mesh underlay. So these are the kinds of underlay that can be applied to a steel stitch, and they may not be the same as a satin path or as a standard fill. Currently, when you click on a shape, you get what's known as the default, and the default steel stitch has no underlay. So I always usually change that to have at very least a center line. And now it really kind of comes down to how wide is my stitch, because right now it's currently 2.5 millimeters wide. Well, the smallest I ever make these is about 1, and if it was 1, I would only really have enough space for a center line of underlay. But if that column becomes wider, and there's not a specific number, but maybe around 2 millimeters, it starts to become wide enough that maybe just one center line doesn't feel like enough underlay. Then I would say perhaps a parallel underlay, or in addition to, or as an alternative. So whatever you check will get added. So now I'm going to have a center line and a parallel. So now I say update, and so you see it stitch out, and it does the center line. Where are you? Well, there's the parallel, and there's the center line. And then it does the cover stitching. And so there's 2 layers of underlay. And like I said, underlay really are important stitches for the quality of the embroidery. If this column got wider, so maybe it's now 3 millimeters wide, and you click apply, then this is starting to get wider, and maybe there's enough room to add a contour underlay, and I could do maybe a contour plus a parallel. And if you really want to beef up the underlay, then you can go with a contour and a zigzag. And so this is the whole key of really getting the best results, is getting the best style of underlay. And it takes some trial and error to learn, and you can take notes from Trevor and learn from all of your favorite teachers. But there's also our save to sew. Let's not forget about save to sew. For example, if I fill this shape in, well, when you fill in a shape, you always get the default settings. The default setting for a standard fill is, if you select it, an underlay of a perpendicular. So if you're not sure which kind of underlay you should change to, maybe you need to click on Save to Sew, where you can tell the software what you're stitching it on. And so if I say I'm sewing on a baby onesie, and then it's something that I made or I digitized, and I ask the software to update the style settings, in other words, they can change the properties for density, underlay, pull compensation, and other things like stitch angles. And if I say next, it goes to work on the design, and I can see already that it's added a contour to the edge of the perpendicular. Let me just click back. See how it changed? I also sense that the shape got a little wider. Let's do it again. Next. Did you see that? This just the edge got a little bigger. That means Save to Sew not only added a layer of underlay, it added some pull compensation. And if I click back, I could try a different kind. And what you'll find is that depending on the type of embroidery, the shape that you have, and depending on the fabric that you choose based upon the Floriani kind of family recipes, the stitching will give different results, and it will change. And so if you do something like fleece, you'll see the software will add that kind of netting that we were talking about, the lattice underlay. And again, I noticed that it got a little extra pull compensation. And so that is one of the cool things about Save to Sew, is that it actually can improve your embroidery designs for you. And one way or another, it's a really awesome that Floriani gives so much control over the underlay. Really even more control than we've talked about, because just as another example, if you select your shape and you go to the properties box, not only can we control what kind of underlay, so a contour plus a full lattice, we can also, here, let's go back to a perpendicular. We can also determine the density of that perpendicular. So if I say apply, this is 2 millimeter spacing, but if I select it and come to the underlay tab and change that to be 4 instead of 2 and click apply, then you'll notice that it has less underlay and more space between the rows. So you really can take control of that underlay stitching. Another option in here is the stitch length. So the density and the length of the underlay, and also the inset, which means how far in from the edge of the shape would you like your underlay to go. So if you're having a contour and you set the inset larger, it will bring that stitch further to the inside. And if you make this smaller, it will be closer to the edge. So that it really is an example of why you could call this program Floriani Total Control, because you really do have that professional level of control. When you want it, you can take it. But if you're not sure, we've got awesome tools like Save to Sew, which is perfect for a new person. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's R&K Software Club's video for the week. And until next week, have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.